Summer's in full swing, bringing vacations, family gathering, and lots of time with the kids. But if you're worried about your co-parent's alcohol use, this season can also be very stressful. And that's where SoberLink comes in. Imagine your kids are off on a beach trip with your co-parent. With SoberLink, you'll receive instant proof of your ex's sobriety via text or email. These portable, discreet devices use built-in facial recognition and tamper sensors to prevent cheating, giving you peace of mind that your kids are safe no matter where they are. SoberLink is more than just a breathalyzer and is second to none when it comes to rebuilding trust and improving accountability. I've personally seen it work for others, and I know it can work for you. So safeguard your summer with SoberLink. Visit soberlink.com/Susan to learn more and get $50 off on your device.
Coming up on today's episode of the Divorce and Beyond podcast.
Having those communication boundaries and how you're going to communicate is very vital to the next steps of how things are going to sort of transition in a way that's more amicable and respectful.
Hello, and welcome to the Divorce and Beyond podcast. I'm Susan Guthrie, your host. As a top divorce attorney and family law mediator for 30 years, I know what you need to know to get through your divorce, and most importantly, how to move beyond it to thrive and transition to your new future. My experts and I are here to give you the insider view into the process, so listen in for the wisdom and expert information you need on your journey through divorce and beyond. Hello and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Susan Guthrie, your host, and listeners, I have a special treat for you. Jan and Jillian Yuhas are back with us. They were with me, ladies, I think it was about the third episode ever of the podcast that you two joined me for. And it's so delightful now to have you back. Things have changed for you. You were in Chicago when we first met, when I first moved here, which tells us how long ago it was. It was 5 years ago. But now you're in Texas and you have launched a brand new book, which I'm so excited about. It's just coming out now. Listeners, of course, as always, there will be links in the show notes for you to everything. But let me just introduce everyone to you just so that they remember if they haven't been listening for the whole 5 years. Jan Yuhas and Jillian Yuhas. So if you're not watching the video, I have two beautiful identical twins facing me as well. That was how I first met you. But they are both MFTs and they work as relationship, boundary, and conflict resolution consultants. And very importantly, they are now the international best-selling authors of Boundary Badass, a powerful method for elevating your value and relationships. So we're going to be talking about how to be a boundary badass today, something certainly I know many of you out there are working on. But first, Jan and Jillian, thank you so much for coming back.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Susan.
I remember that from the last episode. You guys have a wonderful way of being able to do stereo when you talk. So it's exciting. This is like a brand new, everyone I talk to, I've had several of our friends on over the years who have put out books. I know how much work and effort goes into literally almost birthing a book. But this has been like being boundary badasses has been your passion since the day I met you. This is not a new topic for the two of you, is it?
No, it's not. It's been a passion of ours for quite some time. Actually, I would say we developed the method in our first entrepreneurial endeavors about 15 years ago. So yeah, it's been a passion of ours for quite some time.
Yeah, you've been helping people become boundary badasses for those 15 years. So it's wonderful that you've distilled this down, really your method, into the book. But I'm wondering, maybe you can share for my listeners, because we talked about this just a moment ago. This is, really divorce, people who are either going into divorce, going through divorce, or going into a world post-divorce, which is often a co-parenting world. when do you need to be a boundary badass? When does this even come up? Why is this so important? Because I would say everyone needs to be a boundary badass, but why?
I think in the initial stages of divorce, a lot of times when they're transitioning that relationship, there can be a lot of still relationship patterns that get displaced onto the co-parenting relationship if children are involved, or when they're trying to decide who takes what in terms of financial assets and marital assets of that nature. So I think a lot of times having those communication boundaries and how you're going to communicate is very vital to the next steps of how things are going to sort of transition in a way that's more amicable and respectful.
Yeah. And, I'm wondering what your thoughts are, because one thing that not being a therapist myself, but having been immersed certainly in the world of divorce for so many years, when we talk about boundaries, people who are going into and going through divorce, very often they are completely lacking in boundaries. They have those, if they ever had them, they have completely eroded either through the relationship or through the demise of the relationship. And I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on why, we drop those boundaries and then have such a difficulty, if we ever had them, have such a hard time even recognizing that we don't have sufficient boundaries and getting them back.
So a lot of times if the relationship dynamic is very toxic or conflictual, within the marriage dynamic, usually this comes from an unresolved childhood wound that is getting projected onto the marital discord. And so when a partner has unresolved childhood wounds from one of their parents through childhood, usually that shows up in our romantic relationships as well, because our attachment style with our parents is usually how we have attachment with our romantic partner as well. And so really that anger or resentment or aggression they have towards one of their parents, they're taking it out on their partner.
And so I think a lot of times the person who's receiving that type of behavior, they almost are fearful to speak up because they feel like they've either been manipulated to be silenced or shunned to be, don't tell, people our business, keep it behind closed doors. So I think a lot of times when they're starting to speak up again, it's really hard and they're fearful of what may happen if they do start to set those boundaries.
Yeah, especially in course of control dynamics, if one partner threatens, I'm going to do X, Y, Z to you if you tell anybody about this, or I'm going to stop giving you money. So they withhold finances. So when you're in a very coercive dynamic, there's usually threats being placed on that person, which can make it challenging for somebody to own their value.
Right. Especially if you are trying to extricate yourself from that relationship, right?
Yes.
I mean, you're talking about this coercive control or a relationship that has an unequal dynamic. Very often that just ramps up as people go through this. So being able to start setting boundaries is a critical skill, I would say, for people in this divorce process, very specifically for high conflict, but really all of us. But so often people come at it from a place of more ultimatum setting, I would say, right? Like they draw a line it's a brick wall, not a line in the sand. There's no flexibility to it. So I know you distinguish between a boundary and an ultimatum. I'm wondering what the difference might be.
So when it comes to setting a boundary, we're using a we mindset, and we're also making requests to the other party because both people need to have a voice in the boundary if both people are going to be honoring it. Now, we may have personal boundaries with ourselves in terms of how we live our life or how we get up and
or
go
if you
to
need
gym.
to protect yourself from danger or self-harm.
But when it comes to setting a boundary with our ex or co-parent, we actually have to make a request and coming from that we mindset, because that's going to allow them to want to work collaboratively with us versus telling them what to do, which is more of an ultimatum, which ultimatums come from a me mindset. Like, I'm not going to answer your phone calls if you keep calling such and such, after hours or whatever it is. And so that's telling them versus saying, it seems like we're not on the same page when it comes to communication. I value constructive communication. How about we find a time that works for both of us to speak?
So it almost sounds like you come at a boundary with a buy-in for both people to participate in the boundary setting. And that's sort of one of the keys maybe to the success of that boundary.
Yes, so our method is a blend of interpersonal psychology and conflict resolution skills. And so we're negotiating agreements so each person has a voice in the boundary. So it's more likely to uphold accountability, integrity for the relationship with that boundary.
And that's so interesting because I'm wondering, right? We were just talking a moment ago about the more high conflict or abusive relationship. And I would say, is there a difference where you can have this cooperative boundary setting with perhaps some situations, but are there situations, say, that are more high conflict or more perhaps dealing with types of abuse where ultimatums or a harder line is more necessary?
I think it depends on the situation. If you are communicating with a co-parent, we're definitely going to recommend to try the collaborative route first, because obviously a judge is going to see that you're actually trying to work with them. So I think it's very key. Now, if they provide no solutions or alternatives, even or how to create that agreement, then you might need to set a hard line in terms of, okay, I'm only going to communicate on such and such days, as it seems like we can't come to an agreement.
I like that, because that's very, very smart. I can say from the perspective of the attorney who's been in the room or in the courtroom, yes, a judge will value the fact that you gave effort to trying to collaboratively and or cooperatively come to agreements. But if one party won't come to the playground and actually play and buy in and work on those boundaries, sometimes, and maybe it's a method of, you mentioned earlier, protecting yourself, because at a point in time, you have to set a boundary to protect your time, your energy, your mental health, whatever that might be.
Right. So if you set a communication boundary or try to negotiate that you'll communicate, for example, on every Monday and Thursday, and they're just refusing to come up with communication days, this is because it's triggering to them that they're feeling rejected, even though you're just trying to negotiate a reasonable plan in regards to co-parenting and making decisions. But usually the high conflict person will feel rejected or abandoned and feel triggered by that because they have that unresolved wound. And so then they'll keep blasting you with messages every single day just to keep provoking you until they can emotionally try to trigger the other person. So that's when, yes, you have to uphold your own boundaries, because we're all responsible for our own boundaries.
Yeah. And that's, of course, bringing to mind, as all my listeners, I'm sure, are thinking, that's when you have to start biffing somebody. So putting out a little Bill Eddy wisdom there. But, I'm wondering, because you just mentioned, right, some of the instances where someone might need to set boundaries, right? When there's communication that's coming in at all hours and in floods, like a fire hose of communication, and it's not particularly constructive communication often. What are some of the other situations where someone who's listening now might need to consider it's time to be setting some boundaries?
I would say some of the biggest sources of conflict are parent-child calls, withholding medical information and transparency, unilateral decision-making for extracurricular activities is very common.
Also, I would say if they have a temporary order and there's not, they haven't got the parenting plan agreement yet, sometimes in terms of drop-off and pickup exchange times can be a huge source of conflict.
Yeah. And when so what I'm hearing really is that, when the conflict is arising, where there are areas where one or both parties are unable to come to agreements or don't have them yet, as you mentioned, or just feeling that conflict around particular topics, that's where it's time to start looking at setting those boundaries. Is that right?
Yeah. Correct. And often sometimes you might have a physiological cue that's saying like something feels off or something doesn't feel good. But if we don't voice our value and speak up in those moments, then the other party may not even be aware that it's a boundary that we would want to establish, or it's something that is uncomfortable for us. And so that's our cue to really start to honor our voice and tune into that and lean into it and actually advocate for what it is that we need.
So the word I heard in there, advocate and communicate, and this is really all, boundaries have a lot to do with communication. No?
Yes, it is a communication approach at the end of the day.
Right? It's all about, you can have all the boundaries in the world that you want in here. And I'm pointing to my head for those who are not listening. But if you're not communicating them to the person or people that you're trying to set boundaries with, they're kind of useless, aren't they?
Well, right, because people can't read our minds. Even if you've spent being married to somebody for 20 years and you know that person inside and out, they still may not be able to read your mind as to what it is that you value. And if you're operating from emotion, that's only going to have us going in circular conversations rather than operating from our values. And so that's where a lot of people get stuck, as they said, when it comes to co-parenting boundaries, it's more like a business format in terms of setting them rather than say, I feel, because if you tell a high conflict person how you feel, they're going to use that to manipulate you and turn it against you. So you have to address the bigger disconnect within the relationship itself. Even though if you feel triggered, like I feel blindsided when I don't know what's going on with the kid's medical. So you would set the boundary from feeling blindsided that you might need. The opposite of that might be transparency, is the value that you're setting the boundary from. So our emotional triggers, the opposite of that is the value, and that's how we set the boundary.
I think the biggest thing is we remove the emotional component when it comes to setting boundaries, because we want it to feel more of like agreement. And because emotions are often one-sided perspective, values are universally understood. So when we communicate from a place of value, we're more likely to be heard and understood. And the message is more likely to be received in a positive, constructive manner, because it shows that we're trying to create something together collaboratively versus demanding someone to do something different.
Hey, listeners. Are you navigating the tough waters of divorce and feeling overwhelmed by the process? Let me introduce you to Hello Divorce, your ultimate ally in making this journey smoother and less stressful. Hello Divorce offers a modern, affordable approach to divorce, combining expert legal advice with easy-to-use online tools. So whether you need help with paperwork, mediation, or simply some guidance, Hello Divorce has you covered. Plus, their flat fee services mean no hidden costs, just clear upfront pricing. Visit hellodivorce.com today to learn more and take the first step toward your fresh start. Remember, you don't have to do this alone. Hello Divorce is here to help. Stay tuned for more from Jan and Jillian as they share their innovative method for becoming a boundary badass in all aspects of your life. It's a game changer.
Right. I think one of the big misconceptions out there is a lot of people they'll call them boundaries, but they're setting them from a trauma-based perspective, such as this is what I need, this is my needs, so I need for safety. But when it comes to relationships, all that does is breed resentment and greater disconnect, because you have only your belief system that's, playing out in your boundary or ultimatum, rather than both people coming to the table who have two different belief systems that we have to find common ground on.
If you are enjoying this episode, don't forget to check out the almost 300 episodes we have in the archive. We have all the top experts on every topic related to divorce and to thriving in your beautiful beyond. So visit the podcast website at divorceandbeyondpod.com for more.
And now we return to today's show.
See this, every day with people, and as a mediator myself, working with people to try to craft agreements. I find it really a fascinating idea to come at boundary setting as a collaborative exercise as well. And, what people, I always explain to people the big difference between litigation and, say, mediation when you're going through your divorce is litigation is all about coercion. It's all about being forced to do things, being ordered to do things, being compelled to do things, which frankly, nobody responds very well to. Nobody likes to be told what to do, right?
Correct.
Ultimatum. Nobody likes ultimatums. Versus, although sometimes they're necessary, right? And so our judge's orders sometimes. But this idea of cooperatively crafting boundaries that work for everyone is really quite brilliant. So as I said, bravo. And I'm just wondering, when we're talking about boundaries, we've talked about the boundaries around some of the co-parenting relationship, around some of the communication and things that cause conflict. Are there other types of boundaries that people should be aware of?
Yeah, for example, personal boundaries. Maybe you no longer allow this person in your home because that's your safe space. That's your personal space. So that would be a personal boundary. Or you no longer communicate on text message or phone. You only use email or a co-parenting app. You also might have personal boundaries in regards to taking care of yourself emotionally and mentally, because the divorce process can be such a draining emotional process. So you really have to honor your self-care on a day-to-day basis to fill up your own cup.
I also think too, there may be other boundaries that come up, especially if you owned a business together. So having business, boundaries, professional boundaries, and how you're going to work and navigate that. Are you going to still work together, or are you going to sell the business or go separate ways? And so a lot of that comes into play too, if people have a business or there's, shared investments in regards to owning a business too as a couple.
So it really can come up in almost any, and we're talking very specifically here about divorce and co-parenting situations. I mean, honestly, I think boundaries come up in almost any relationship and in any, right? Work, friends, family, life, and with ourselves.
Yeah, intellectual boundaries, time boundaries, digital boundaries, emotional boundaries, neighbor boundaries. I could,
every chapter in the book is dedicated to a specific type. So
yeah.
So there's something for everyone. All right, good. Because, and I think we've sort of, I hope listeners are getting to the point that they understand just how essential these are. But let's talk about, so you recognize, right? This is something here is not working. I can feel the pit in my stomach telling me that something needs to change here. Boundary setting, collaborative boundary setting needs to be happening. How do you do it?
So the first step is, the method is ASAP. So the first step is assess, and we want to assess when something is bothering us. So we want to ask a discovery question, which is an open-ended question. Can you share more about why you're doing XYZ, or help me understand how come you're not picking up the phone? So you're wanting to uncover and understand their behavior that's disturbing you or is unfavorable in the situation. And then once you've gathered a little bit more insight, then the next step is to set a boundary around your value that is feeling breached in that moment. And then you're going to make a request in the relationship, hoping you guys can find a resolution. So then the next step, A, which is come up with an agreement as you negotiate back and forth in regards to how you're going to resolve this behavior that doesn't feel good or is disrespectful to the relationship. And then P is you're going to proceed forward with that plan of action that you've agreed upon and hope that both parties are going to maintain that agreement in order to show respect for the relationship.
Wow, I'm a huge fan of acronyms, first of all. So I love the ASAP. That makes it and breaks it down into such a simple format to be thinking of, especially assess, because I always, my listeners know, I say it, I think on every episode, awareness is the beginning of everything, right? Being aware, because I think so often, especially in a difficult co-parenting dynamic or during divorce, when we're feeling all those really lovely emotions toward each other and all that, right? It's a difficult time. And so we're feeling it, but we're not particularly aware of the emotional turmoil that's going on for us and how we're responding to it. So I think starting with just settling into the awareness around and being curious. I didn't mention when I introduced the ladies, but both of you are trained mediators as well. I know that you have mediation. It's showing right now. I hear your inner mediators coming out, because as a mediator, one of our most valuable skill sets is our inherent curiosity. And, so often it's easy to be mad at your spouse or your co-parent because something's wrong or you don't like something they're doing. But you've turned that into be curious about why they're doing it that way. And that's really so critical.
Right. A lot of times if somebody, for example, say they make a unilateral decision and they make a doctor's appointment for the kids, they never told you about it, and you find out when you get like the bill in the mail. So you're feeling blindsided in that moment. So rather than saying, why did you make an appointment for the child? Why am I just now finding out about that's making an accusation towards them? First, you want to say, can you help me understand how come I'm receiving a bill? When did so-and-so go to the doctor and what for? You're trying to understand their perspective. So that person is more likely to give you information rather than shutting down or becoming defensive back at you. And the more insight we can gain, the more we can direct it to a resolution.
Yeah, the more you have to work with, right? If you go, you jerk, why you're not supposed to schedule them for meetings without me, blah, 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 blah. You're right. What information are you going to get other than usually, as we all know, an escalation of the conflict? So very, very, very helpful. I love the idea of being curious, gathering that information. And then once you have that, working to come to that agreement, working to set that boundary, especially if it's by agreement, because as we talked about, when there's an agreement, people are much, much more likely to honor it, the agreement that they said. But we know that doesn't always happen, right? Especially in the heat of the moment of divorce. So what happens when someone doesn't honor even an agreed upon boundary?
So in that moment, that's where you can bring up the boundary that was originally agreed upon and say, is this boundary no longer feasible? Is it no longer workable for this relationship? Do we need to come up with a new boundary that's going to work for us? Or do we need to redefine how we actually engage with each other so we can each feel respected as we move forward towards the next step in our, life path. And so sometimes it's, like I said, either coming up with a new boundary or redefining how we engage with this person if they're not willing to work with us. And that's where you're honing into your power and value without trying to project your own needs onto someone who's not willing to actually work with us. And so we have to know when people are willing to work and when they're not. And so that's how we take back our power, though, and maintain our direction by just owning our truth.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing you say is when somebody doesn't respect the boundary, they said they were, they participated in setting, that curiosity comes back into play again. Can you help me understand why this boundary didn't work, and do we need to make changes to it again, rather than the usual knee-jerk response of, you jerk, you told me we would agree to do this and you didn't do it. Take some self-control, right? Because our first response when someone doesn't honor a boundary, I think, is usually, especially if it's one that they agreed to and participated in creating, might be anger or frustration. So what do you suggest? Because often these things happen in the moment, right? We're face to face or we're on a screen together like we are or something like that. How do you help your clients or the people you work with stay calm in those moments?
So emotional regulation is going to be very important to do in our own lives on a daily basis. And actually self-love takes a fraction of the time compared to self-care. Self-care is how we physically take care of ourselves, where self-love is how we emotionally and mentally take care of ourselves. And so doing like deep breathing exercises, value alignment exercises, journaling, doing that 5 to 10 minutes a day will help you regulate your own emotions so you remain in control and powerful when you are communicating your needs. And sometimes also, if it's like a heated discussion, you can also say, look, we're not agreeing right now. Let's take a step back from this and revisit it tomorrow, and give yourself 24 hours to process and cool down and then have the conversation.
But I think the biggest thing is set a time or day of when you're going to regroup. So that way you're not just saying I'm exiting this conversation and it's over with. You're just saying we're not gonna be able to reach an agreement. So let's give ourselves some time to come up with new perspective. So that way when we regroup, we can actually be amicable and actually hear each other out and hopefully find a resolution.
I like that. That's like setting a boundary around taking a break. Let's set a boundary. You guys are good. You're like working those boundaries in there. And it is, I would imagine, I think for many people, they think, okay, boundary, it's like putting up a brick wall. It has to be, guarded and held to and defended. My boundaries. We hear so much, right, about boundaries these days. But what you're really describing is a pretty fluid process of your ASAP over and over again to keep healthy boundaries that actually work and are effective.
Right. I think one of the big misconceptions out there is a lot of people they'll call them boundaries, but they're setting them from a trauma-based perspective, such as this is what I need. This is my needs. This is what I need for safety. But when it comes to relationships, all that does is breed resentment and greater disconnect because you have only your belief system that's, playing out in your boundary or ultimatum rather than both people coming to the table who have two different belief systems that we have to find common ground on.
Yeah. So it's almost like a toxic boundary or a boundary that's actually going to poison the ongoing relationship, because really boundaries mostly come up, or I think we're talking about them here, at least in the context of people having ongoing contact in relationships. It may be a totally different kind of relationship, such as romantic partner to co-parent, which we know are vastly different, but it is still an ongoing relationship. And just as your children are going to grow up and things are going to change for them, I would imagine your need and the boundaries around the structure of that relationship will change as well.
Yes, boundaries can continue to evolve depending on how the relationship continues to evolve. So obviously, we're human. We keep making changes in our lives as we're evolving. So sometimes specific boundaries we set originally may no longer apply to the dynamics of that relationship, and it has to be redefined. Or you experience a new incident that means a new boundary has to go into place. So yes, they are a very fluid, ongoing process.
And maybe that's part of, we need to come up with a different word, although boundary badass is so good. But boundary sounds so permanent. It sounds so to me, it always brings to mind this like thick wall. But really what I see here is more like a permeable wall, but the holes or the ways to get through it, or the holes that will let you through, are movable, are adjustable, are
boundaries are more like a gate. Yeah, boundaries are more like a gate, where ultimatums are more like a wall. So like you have to think you're letting in the good keeping in the good, but letting out the bad. So you're able to navigate. But that's what allows us to be healthy too. If we're too rigid with our boundaries, that's
a fixed mindset and black and white thinking, which usually comes from unresolved trauma, rather than having a growth mindset, which is a fluid mentality and flexibility.
Well, which is, I think, a whole new conversation for us to have, right? Because what I'm hearing there is something that I find quite often, right, is that people find it very easy to focus on how another person needs to change, or what they're doing wrong, et cetera, right? But so much of the work often lies within for us, healing our trauma, dealing with our past issues.
Correct. And I think too, we can't, if we're not changing something within ourselves and how we're approaching a situation, how can we expect somebody else to change when we're not doing something that's going to create a greater impact in a healthy way to make a better, an impact or influence the other person to want to make change as well. Because if you're telling someone what to do, they're not going to change. But if you influence them to say, hey, we're not on the same page, what can we do to get better aligned? Then they're more likely to want to communicate, because then they get to talk about themselves, which people love to do. So then you get them talking, which is the key.
Yeah, absolutely. Give them an opportunity to talk about how they feel and what they want, and most people are going to buy into that. So, well, I think, listeners, you've heard the value of becoming a boundary badass and gotten some of the golden nuggets about how you can actually do that. But I know that people are going to want to actually get the book. So if you could share the best way for them to do that, as well as just to get in touch with you and find out more about you, ladies.
Yes, they can head over to janandjillian.com or divorcefamilymediations.com, and there will be links on our website to every place that you can purchase the book.
Which is wonderful. And your Instagram handles, because I follow you both, or I follow you on Instagram. You guys are always posting really great content that especially, well, I always think for people who are going through divorce or through these issues, it's really helpful to have those daily reminders that you guys are posting.
Yeah, you can follow us at Divorce Family Mediations or Jan and Jillian.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate your coming back, and thank you so much for really taking your method, your boundary badass method, and putting it into a format that we all can access. I appreciate it on my own behalf. I have a situation in my own mind right now where I'm thinking, all right, I got to reach out and do a little cooperative boundary setting right now because my ultimatums are not working. So thank you very much. And I will have you, we'll be back in touch because I'd love to have you come on and we'll talk about that work on yourself aspect rather than focusing on what you can change in someone else.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for joining me today on the Divorce and Beyond podcast. I hope you found some information and inspiration to help you on this journey. Please join me every Monday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for a new episode. And if you like the show, please take the time to subscribe and leave me a 5-star review on iTunes. You can also find more information on the website at divorceandbeyondpod.com, where you'll find links to the YouTube channel, transcripts of the episodes, and other bonus content. So I'll see you next week to help you move through your divorce and beyond.